author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we're going to be talking free speech and the First Amendment, the dirty little secret of Joe Biden's jobs numbers, and ask whether the war in Ukraine is even winnable at this point. All that and a whole lot more on today's show. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Recent weeks have seen First Amendment cases hit the Supreme Court. It dominates media narratives, and yet doesn't seem to be improving. I'm, of course, talking about the First Amendment rights of American citizens. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us today Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent, Mr. Graham J. Noble, to discuss free speech, the First Amendment, and which way the wind blows on this topic. Graham, thanks for being here.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here, Mark.
So, Graham, neither of us are born Americans, and yet I find fun that we often do talk about the First Amendment free speech, but it's quite unique in the world, isn't it, to have an ability that the government cannot deny your right to speech, and that is unique in the world, isn't it, Graham?
Yeah, it certainly is, Mark. I mean, I think there are a lot of things about the Constitution that make America, talk about American exceptionalism, which is something that has almost become a kind of a bad phrase now, a taboo phrase.
It's a dirty word in some circles, isn't it?
At least on the political left. But yeah, I mean, America is an exceptional country for so many of the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. I don't know everything about the founding laws of every country, certainly, but I can't personally think of another country that actually has a whole set of prohibitions on what the government can do to its citizens.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction that so many people miss. Like the European Union, for example, or England, my country, we have laws that say they protect free speech, but what they really do is they're placing limits on what an individual can say. A lot of this, especially nowadays, comes under the hate speech rubric. But in America, for all its beautiful exceptionality, I don't know if that's a real word, but I'm going to stick with it. Its beautiful exceptionality, it restricts the government from what they can do to you. And that's the key difference. In
Yes.
all these other countries, the laws are about restricting what you can do. In America, it's restricting what the government can do to you. I think that's such a beautiful thing, and it makes me wonder why we're even having this debate about, this discussion about why free speech appears to be under threat. The First Amendment appears to be under threat in the United States, because surely the people who live under that wonderful, wonderful Constitution should be celebrating it, but they're not, are they, Graham?
Well, I think the foundation of this discussion lies in the way the left, the progressive left, views the Constitution, and you see they don't like it for that very reason, that it restricts government. I remember once former President Barack Obama once said this, and I think it was before he actually became president. I think maybe it was when he was campaigning back in 2008. He actually sat down for an interview, and they were talking about the Constitution, and he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, well, the most fundamental flaw in the Constitution is that it says what the government what the government cannot do to you, and it doesn't say enough about what the government should do for you. And that's that fundamental misunderstanding of the Constitution that exists on the left. They just can't grasp the concept of the government being restricted in its actions. They just can't grasp it.
It's a very, nobody should be surprised that President Barack Obama had a very statist attitude. So let's branch this out a little bit, Graham. So much communication nowadays is carried out digitally. People are probably watching this either on a computer or listening to it on a radio station. Radio stations are very much becoming digital. But people use social media so much now for not only gathering their news, but for communicating their ideas out to the world. And free speech is a huge, huge issue in this realm. We did mention briefly Biden versus Missouri, which we'll get back to. But it seems to me that social media companies nowadays, there's only really one of the big players, and that's X, Twitter, that is selling itself as a free speech platform. And one would think that this should be something that every platform wants to push, right? Because, I mean, what's the alternative? Come and join our platform. We limit what you can say based on our opinions, not yours. I mean, that's the alternative, right?
It is kind of a painful kind of irony that we actually have social media platforms that do have to, kind of the way they're promoting themselves is by saying, it's a free speech. you shouldn't
It's a
even
free
to
speech
say that.
free zone.
You shouldn't even have to say that, really. I mean, that's kind of like
Yeah.
I don't know. To me, that's like a kind of a shooting range having a big sign on the door saying, "We allow you to bring your guns here."
Yeah. It is. It's a strange, but I wonder, because obviously you've still got all these other ones other than X that are still running with their models that they do. I mean, they do some major business. They've got some major cash, but I wonder if people will become disillusioned because what is being restricted, and a lot of people make this point, but nice phrases and friendly chatter don't need the First Amendment to protect them, right? It's alternative opinions, it's combative opinions, it's forthright opinions that need the First Amendment protection from the government, from the government shutting them down. But I think because, especially in today's political climes, if you take one tiny step off the postage stamp size consensus, then you're automatically an enemy of the progressive bubble, as it were. And I think that what will happen is once people realize that, well, hang on, I can be targeted too, I think that's what will change. And then people will be like, I'd better just pack my bags and head to X, right?
Yeah. I think the most insidious kind of new trend now is this whole thing about you've got misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. I haven't quite figured out how those categories are kind of separately defined, but
they're defined by their pronouns, of course.
But that is that this is the way now. This whole new invention about misinformation and how dangerous it is for people to spread misinformation. It's the way that they circumvent, and it's the way that the Biden administration is completely circumventing the First Amendment, because they're basically saying, well, we're not threatening free speech. This isn't about the First Amendment. We're just simply saying that you shouldn't be able to post misinformation or disinformation on social media. We're not actually censoring anyone's speech. We're just protecting democracy by making sure that you don't say things that we have decided are not true.
And of course, in that they give themselves the position of arbiter of what is true. Right. Johnny Cash would be very disappointed. Now, we'll be back with Graham J. Noble after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent, Graham Noble. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking the generalities of free speech, the First Amendment in the United States. But now I'd like to dive a little bit more into specifics, Graham. Now, I've got a clip for you to listen to. So if you could just take a quick listen to this. Listeners, you tune in your ears as well. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., presidential candidate, independent, speaking with CNN.
But do you really believe that when people talk about the threat to democracy that Trump poses, do you really think that is an equal evil to Biden?
I mean, listen, I can make the argument that President Biden is a much worse threat to democracy. And the reason for that is President Biden is the first candidate in history, the first president in history that has used the federal agencies to censor political speech, so to censor his opponent. I can say that because I just won a case in the Federal Court of Appeals and now before the Supreme Court that shows that he started censoring not just me. 37 hours after he took the oath of office, he was censoring me. No president in the country has ever done that. The greatest threat to democracy is not somebody who questions election returns, but a president of the United States who used the power of his office to force the social media companies, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to open a portal and give access to that portal to the FBI, to the CIA, to the IRS, to CISA, to NIH, to censor his political critics. President Biden, for the first president in history, to use his power over the Secret Service to deny Secret Service protection to one of his political opponents for political reasons. He's weaponizing the federal agencies. Those are really critical threats to democracy.
What do you make of that, Graham?
Interesting. I'm surprised that I'm almost surprised the CNN host didn't just cut his mic there and then as soon as he suggested that Joe Biden was actually a bigger threat to democracy than Trump. I must say I do agree with that. I mean, okay, so Trump he doesn't talk about it so much anymore, which maybe is a blessing because, quite frankly, I think everyone was getting a little tired of hearing about 2020. Whether or not you really believe that election the result was fixed or not. There comes a point where it's like, we can't continue there's no point in continuing.
Eyes have got to go forward, not backwards, right?
It's not going to make, at this point, the result of that election will never be reversed. But, how much of a threat to democracy is it really to suggest that an election was rigged? For a start, there are plenty of people on the other side. There are plenty of Democrats who have complained about supposedly rigged elections.
Hillary Clinton, for one.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton for one. Stacey Abrams. And of course, there are still people who go back to the Bush-Gore election Florida. and still insist that George W. Bush stole that election from Al Gore, so but does it really threaten our democracy to question the outcome of elections? I would suggest that the moment we say you are not allowed to question the result of an election, you no longer have democracy. I mean, to me, it's an integral part of democracy to be able to actually question whether or not an election was fairly conducted.
Well, not only that, Graham, I think that this rises to everything, and this very much ties in with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s position on COVID-19. The second that a government decides to shut down or try and limit what you can ask about, well, then that's a problem. That's an infringement, clearly, of the First Amendment. But not only that, it shows an overwhelming disdain for the idea that all ideas, no matter how unpleasant, no matter how reactionary, no matter how vile in some cases, should be disinfected by sunlight. Ideas should be out there, because otherwise what happens? You end up with people in, strange people in basements plotting revenge for nobody listening to them. And that, it creates a powder keg environment.
Yeah. I mean, the entire founding idea of democracy is that you have a government which is accountable to the people who elected that government. The people elected the leaders, and therefore the leaders are accountable to the people. And the moment that any government says, well, you're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that, you're not allowed to question our motives when we, enacted this policy or we put this into law, you're not allowed to question our motives. Well, then, okay, so the government therefore is no longer accountable to the people. And right there, you've just demolished the founding principle of democracy.
Yeah, now let's talk about that. A lot of people, especially this election, it's like, democracy is on the line. Nobody mentions that it's a constitutional republic, of course.
Yeah, right.
But putting that aside for a moment, there's this idea that it's a battle for the soul of the nation. Now, Graham, you and I were discussing very recently a and with our editor-in-chief, we were discussing a piece from the New York Times that compared Donald Trump to claiming that Donald Trump is trying to appear messianic to his followers, the Church of Trump. And the author in that New York Times piece, he specifically said that Donald Trump is making this case that it's a battle for the soul of the nation. And that phrase stuck in my head when I read it. And I did a bit of digging, and of course, Donald Trump actually very rarely talks about the soul of the nation compared to Mr. Joe Biden, Mr. former Vice President, now President Joe Biden. And in fact, there's a very specific speech called The Battle for the Soul of the Nation that took place, I believe it was early September 2022, just before the midterms, in Philadelphia, in front of Independence Hall, with I'm sure everybody who's seen this remembers this. It was this blood red backdrop.
Yes.
And it was the most divisive and partisan speech. Bear in mind, he also had 2 U.S. Marines in uniform flanking him on that, which was highly inappropriate for the type of event it was. And that speech was called the Battle for the Soul of the Nation speech. And it was a theme that was repeated again and again and again. And so they're putting this whole idea forward that everything is on the line in this election. And now Donald Trump has, in fairness, he has also said everything is on the line in this election. But it's not about elections. It's about what you do every day that really matters, because an election is just one day. It's what's happening every time that say, no, you can't post about that. You can't write about that. You can't speak about that. And that's happening on college campuses. You can't have somebody come and speak if they're going to put this kind of view out. You can't use this term because somebody yesterday decided it was an unpleasant term or it might trigger somebody. And it's almost as though the First Amendment is under the threat of death by 1,000 cuts. Graham, your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, it is certainly. There's no question about it, and of course the college campuses are we all know. I'm not saying anything that anyone doesn't already realize. These college campuses are they are the kind of front line, if you like, in the war on free speech, and we've gotten to the point now where these colleges no longer even pretend that they are it's not so much about the First Amendment, because the First Amendment specifically forbids the government from infringing upon your free speech. But these colleges they're now openly restricting free speech, and again the argument is they've turned the argument on its head, and rather than trying to deny that they're restricting anyone's free speech, they're saying, no, we are going to prevent you from saying things which are triggering or hateful or in some way biased against somebody. And so they've kind of made themselves out to be like, oh, we're the good guys. Yes, we are infringing upon your right to free speech, but we're doing it in the name of, it's the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's the situation we're at.
College campuses, the vanguard of censorship. Graham J. Noble, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Sure.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The war between Ukraine and Russia continues to drag on, and more than 2 years down the line appears no end in sight. Or is there? Well, we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, who also happens to be a former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller and happens to know everything there is to know about national security, strategic defense, and things of that nature. Dave Patterson, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on. Good to be with you.
Great. Dave, so I think we're more than 2 years now since Russia invaded Ukraine. And the big surprise is that Ukraine is still fighting this war, I think, isn't it?
I think that would be the surprise, yes. I think that most pundits thought that the Ukraine would fold at least within a couple or 3 months, But the fact is that what they didn't count on and they underestimated was the actual courage and the fortitude of the Ukrainian soldiers and the people to support them. They also, with all due deference, you have to give credit to their president Zelensky, because he has been the face of the courage that is being demonstrated every day on the battlefield.
But it takes a lot more than just courage to win a war, though, doesn't it, Dave?
Well, it does. Actually, you have to have like beans, bacon, and bullets to actually engage the
Not
enemy.
necessarily in that order. I
Not
mean, I always
necessarily
put
in
bacon at the top of every list.
everything goes better with bacon. Maybe
Certainly
apple
does.
pie might be an exception, but I think that what the Russians also did not count on was the rather rapid initial mobilization of NATO and
Hmm.
European friends, and in fact, friends around the world of Ukraine. I mean, you have Japan, South Korea also contributing. So I don't think that President Putin from Russia actually counted on that level of support. At the same time, I have to tell you that it is that support and the way it has been dribbled out, particularly by the United States, that has, in my view, caused this extended fight on the ground. When it just seems to me that every time the president of Ukraine would ask for something, the initial reaction from the Biden administration is, well, we know we can't do that because that would tend to escalate the fighting. For those on the ground, I think they sort of thought that the fighting had already been escalated. But nonetheless, when Poland way back, 2 years ago said, we'll give Ukraine our excess MiG-29s. And of course, initially, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said, good idea, we'll greenlight that, only to be within hours turned around by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And the United States put a hold on that.
Dave, I really want to jump in on this. I think, I mean, what you're saying is clearly an accurate representation of the events that happened. There's no denying that. But I think what a lot of people want to know is, why does the US have such a veto on this? So if Poland wants to send its excess MiG-29s to Ukraine, surely that's just an issue between Poland and Ukraine, right? Why would the US, specifically Blinken or Lloyd Austin, have any say in the matter at all? I think that's an important question, isn't it?
I think that's a very good question. And the answer, unfortunately, is from my cynical point of view, if I put my cynic hat on, is that the United States is NATO. The United States is the largest contributor. The United States tends to be the elephant in the room every time the NATO meets, and the NATO countries tend to look to the United States for guidance. There is a subtle change in this. If you might have noticed that the New Europe, the Baltics particularly, are beginning to say, wait a second, we're the people who were under the Russians and under the Soviet hammer and sickle. We tend to know a little bit about this ourselves. And they provide some pushback. I also have a personal view, and that is that those who look to Biden as the leader of NATO and the NATO policy, I think they have shortchanged Jens Stoltenberg, who, in my view, is truly the unifier for NATO.
Let's stick on the topic of NATO for just a second here, because my field is obviously not defense, but more politics, specifically political interplays. And what I've noticed is that a lot of people are talking about, specifically political pundits are talking about how Donald Trump re-elected would be a disaster for NATO. But I disagree with that assessment, and apparently so does Jens Stoltenberg, because
Absolutely.
If it weren't for Donald Trump in his first term pushing the NATO allies to increase their percentage GDP spending for NATO defense, or for defense in general, they wouldn't be in a position to even help Ukraine aid the war, aid Ukraine in its war efforts now. And going forward, Donald Trump will be very demanding of those other NATO nations, other NATO allies. And I think Jens Stoltenberg, plus I believe the chap most likely to replace him, also thinks that Donald Trump would be a good strong wind behind the NATO sails to get people invested in their own defenses. Or have I misread that?
No, I think you've accurately assessed that. And one of the things that I always point to is that on the occasion of former President Trump's first trip to NATO, where he really laid down, the law to NATO that they needed to do more than under 2% of their GDP, and really, put some heavy words on them. And everybody, all the pundits came back and said, "Oh, what a crass, crude guy Trump is." I mean, just think about this. I mean, he's really putting our great allies in NATO to the test. He shouldn't be doing that. They're doing what they should do. And about 2 months later, Jens Stoltenberg comes and addresses Congress and uses almost the same speech with our Congress. And everybody said, "Oh, what insight! This guy has really got the straight of it." It all has to do. Let's face it. It's Trump's persona. It'll never be anything else. I mean, he could turn oceans into wine and it wouldn't matter. Even the vineyards that we have today would criticize him. It's unfortunate, but nonetheless, I agree with you. Trump, as in another term, would do the same thing and push NATO, and they don't like to be pushed. Let's face it. NATO's working hours are from 9 to 11 and 1 to 3. And
they call a lid for the day. Hang on, are we sure we're not talking about Joe Biden here?
Well, yeah, right. It's why NATO likes him.
So Dave, let's get back.
I'm being a little bit facetious, but nonetheless, I think that we need to, if you want to look at what NATO is thinking and what they, in a way that's constructive, I would say, look at Finland, Sweden, Norway. Look at the Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. These folks are really at the cutting edge of threat from Russia, and I think they have a much better handle on what's going on.
Yeah, they're historically familiar with the situation. There's a couple of things that I really wanted to talk to you about just before we run out of time, Dave. Just playing devil's advocate here, but it seems to me, and you do point this out in a recent article that you wrote on the pages of LibertyNation.com, sponsor of today's radio show. The article was called, let me just check this, Can Ukraine Defeat Russia? And you talk about how it's really become a war of attrition. And I think many of us are familiar with hearing about the amount of ammunition that's being sold or sponsored through Ukraine. But the question for me, Dave, is this is a war of attrition, but this is also a war of attrition of people. And how much longer can Ukraine hold out before it becomes, I don't know how to say this, I guess a generational travesty in terms of it will never be able to recover its population again with the amount of young men's lives spent on the battlefield?
I think that's a very real concern. I think that the help that's needed and has to be provided in a much more dynamic and forceful way. You can't sit back and let the Ukrainian artillery tubes go fallow when they need 8,000 rounds a day, and now they're down to 2,000 rounds a day. That just can't continue. You need to encourage Ukraine to attack Russia in kind. I mean, I found it perverse in the most absurd way that the United States would criticize Ukraine for attacking Russian infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, and tell them not to do that when every single day the Russians have attacked Ukraine infrastructure and their energy. This is ridiculous. we have a national security team in the United States that is totally out of touch with reality. And you know what their excuse was? Well, we're afraid that if the energy is attacked by Ukraine, it'll raise gas prices. You might have thought about that 3 years ago when you came into office.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Despite what the Fourth Estate tells us, it may not be all unicorns and rainbows for the American jobs economy. To join us today to discuss what light lies at the end of the tunnel, is it sunlight or a careering train coming to greet the jobs market, we're joined by Mr. Andrew Moran. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, you wrote a fantastic article this week on the employment figures, because the jobs market, it looks quite good, doesn't it? The view from 30,000 feet, I think they call it. Although, with inflation, that's gone up to 50. It looks quite good, but that's not really the case, is it?
No, so the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, they release a report every quarter called the 50 States and District of Columbia report. And it looks at the Bureau of Labor Statistics quarterly census of employment and wages, or QCEW report. And it found that all those monthly jobs reports that the BLS reports were completely overstated. So the Fed Bank of Philadelphia noted that as through December 2023, the BLS overstated job growth by 800,000. So the official tally is that the U.S. government, the U.S. economy created 3 million, but subtracted by 800,000, that's the real number. So the Fed is,
sorry, Andrew, I got to interrupt. I love that you did a bit of a Freudian slip there, because you said that the federal government created.
Yeah.
That's actually not far off the truth, is it, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the BLS jobs data, you show that the federal government, or government in general, has been the top job creator in 2023. And that's the official number. So if you look at just government jobs in general, it's they were the top job creator. But if you also factor in sectors that rely heavily on government funding, like healthcare or social assistance, then you would assume that the government accounted for pretty much half of all jobs. And then you add in sustenance jobs like retail, leisure, and hospitality, and you suggest, okay, so the main employment trends in the United States today is either government or sustenance jobs, and that's not really a good portrait of an economic landscape.
It's not. I was sorry to interrupt you on your flow there. So let's get back to that. So it's actually 800,000 jobs overestimated with these rainbow glasses that they seem to be wearing, but that's not the only problem, is it?
Well, I guess the other factor, too, if that's what you're alluding to, if the divergence between the establishment and the household surveys, as you and I have repeatedly discussed, you see such a huge gap. So, for example, in the last jobs report, it showed that the economy lost about 184,000, as opposed to the establishment survey, which showed about 275,000 new jobs, which, of course, will be downwardly revised. So, you can't apply malice to perhaps the statisticians. You could just perhaps either apply incompetence or just people fiddling around with the Microsoft Excel formula sheet.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. So what does this really mean for the economy in general? We have less jobs coming in. So I may be going about this the wrong way, but it seems to be where my mind leads me on this. Now, we have these projected jobs that have turned out to be grossly inflated. And so with that, there's projections of a tax take for the coming years, right? They don't just say, oh, here's the jobs, and they don't do anything else with the data. They start projecting these tax takes that are coming in. And then they craft legislation that says, well, what we'll actually do is we'll receive this much tax money in based on these calculations. And then they pass the legislation, which is essentially just spending. And then, of course, there's a shortfall, isn't there? Because there was 800,000 less jobs, which meant the tax take was more, which means the calculation for the legislation they've passed that is now the law of the land is going to be grossly underfunded. Or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And then this creates a huge problem because then the government's just going to spend more, expecting that, okay, this is the amount of revenue that we're going to receive, either based on this type of tax legislation or this type of stimulus program or whatever concoction that these bureaucrats and politicians come up with. So yes, that's absolutely a problem. And the other factor with jobs data is that by the time, let's say, the QCEW is reported, that's outdated. Those are outdated numbers.
Yeah.
Nobody cares anymore. The financial markets or the Federal Reserve are not going to really pivot, or they're not going to start selling stocks based on something that happened back in May 2023. So the monthly non-farm payrolls report gives cover to the administration, because I highly doubt come November President Biden's going to say, oh well, yeah, November 2023 the numbers were off slightly, but I'm still have a great jobs report. He's just going to focus on the latest numbers and the official tally, and that's going to benefit him tremendously. And Trump is not going to really take advantage of it because he probably has no clue that these numbers are out there.
Well, that's the thing, right? Who really knows that there's so much divergence in thing, because nobody's talking about it. Another thing that people aren't talking about, Andrew, is inflation. What happened? Why is everybody ignoring the fact that inflation is still realistically just added 18% costs to your living, but nobody's talking about it anymore? Why is that?
Well, I would disagree. I think a lot of people are talking about that, especially when you have 2 consecutive months of hotter than expected data. And what's also fascinating is that the way inflation is trending is exactly has been my concern from the 1970s, 1980s, is that it's emulating those trends from that time period. And that's something you and I discussed in this program before, and that's something Liberty Nation has reported on. And so, who knows if it's going to, return to those types of levels. So that's a fascinating trend to watch. The other factor, too, is that there was a great report that came out recently, and it's something that also we've discussed many times. It showed that if you calculated inflation pre-1983, that June 2022 peak of 9% would actually be double. So yeah, in today's environment, you have a climate of where government overstates jobs, understates inflation to make everyone look good.
It's kind of crazy, isn't it? It's the topsy-turvy world. But let's talk about what you just mentioned there, Andrew, with how the data for inflation is counted differently. So I believe what you're referring to here is that the unimportant things, the things that don't really matter to, people, like food and housing, they're not counted in inflation anymore, right? It's just other things like men's trousers and tires. Is that right?
Well, they're all. If you look at the consumer price index, they're all factored into it. The problem with the consumer price index is that are the weights attributed to things. So they said. So, for example, in the CPI, the Bureau of Labor Statistics accounts health insurance for, I think, 5 cents for every dollar you spend. In the United States, is there anybody who spends 5 cents for every dollar applied to health insurance? That is complete nonsense. So the CPI, the way the methodology is done, it's completely wrong. And there's something needs to be done with the way this data is collected, because nothing adds up. The people on the ground see something completely different than what the statisticians see. I think I likened it in my article to the French aristocracy in the 17th century, where everyone was just hanging out in Versailles and they had no clue what was happening in the rest of the country. In the United States, everyone just hangs out in Washington, D.C. with no clue what's happening in Biloxi, Mississippi.
Final question for you, Andrew. Come September, the month before the election, does Joe Biden brag about inflation?
Oh, yeah, of course, because he was going to say, oh, hey, it's down from its peak of 9%. So, yeah, of course he will.
And people will likely be happy with that response. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.